Every state in this country keeps a most wanted list. Not every name on it belongs to a human being. Right now, wildlife agencies in 5 different states are running what amount to actual manhunts against animals, using the same language and the same paperwork you would expect in a criminal case. Case files, bounties, standing orders to bring them in dead, not alive. One state pays $6 a tail, no questions asked. Another legalized shooting from a helicopter and built an entire industry around it. A third state made it against the law to let a certain fish swim away alive. And in one corner of the Pacific Northwest, the government spent 3 straight years hunting an insect the size of your thumb, tracking it back to its hideout with a radio tag glued to its own body. These are not strays. These are outlaws with open case files. And today we are ranking America's 5 most wanted, state by state, from the smallest bounty to the biggest manhunt the country has ever run on a bug. Before we open the first file, subscribe now, because we track down a new outlaw every single week, and you do not want to miss the one that closes this list. It is unlike anything else on here. One quick rule before we start, because it changes everything about how this list works. We are not ranking these 5 animals by how dangerous they are. A house cat could outfight most of what is coming up. We are ranking them by something more interesting: how far the government was willing to go to bring each one down. A cash bounty is page 1 of a case file. A change in hunting law is page 2. A change to the law itself, backed by real fines, is page 3. A full-time paid workforce is further still. And by the time we reach outlaw number 1, you are going to see what it actually looks like when an entire country declares war on something you could hold in one hand. None of these 5 animals are new arrivals hiding in some remote corner of the map either. They are living in the same rivers people fish on weekends, the same brush country ranchers drive through every morning, the same coastal marsh that shows up on postcards. The case files exist precisely because these outlaws have made themselves impossible to ignore. Let's start with the softest sentence on the list and work our way up to the harshest. Outlaw number 5. The state, Louisiana. The alias, Nutria, though most Louisianans just call it the swamp rat, a 20-pound rodent with orange buck teeth and webbed feet that was never supposed to be here in the first place. It arrived in the 1930s, imported from South America for the fur trade by ranchers hoping to cash in on the growing demand for exotic pelts. For a while, the business boomed. Then fashion moved on, fur prices collapsed, and the animals that had been penned up for their coats were simply released or escaped into the surrounding wetlands by the thousands. Nobody drew up a case file at the time. Nobody thought they needed to. They did not disappear, they multiplied. Here is the file on what Nutria actually do. They do not just eat marsh grass, they eat the roots underneath it, which means the ground itself stops holding together. Wildlife officials call the result an eat-out, a patch of wetland chewed so completely bare that it turns to open water within a single season. Louisiana loses land to the Gulf of Mexico faster than almost anywhere else in the country, and Nutria are one of the reasons why. So in 2002, the state opened a case file on the Nutria and put a literal price on its head. The coast-wide Nutria Control Program pays licensed trappers $6 for every tail turned in, raised twice over the years, because the original bounty was not high enough to keep pace with the damage. The season runs from late November through the end of March, and in a good year, more than 200 trappers wade out into the marsh with nothing but a boat, a trap line, and a cooler. The most successful hunters turn in close to 11,000 tails in a single season. That is not a hobby, that is a payroll. Before the bounty existed, the state tried almost everything else. Poison baits in the 1960s, attempts to encourage natural predators like alligators to do the job on their own. None of it worked, because a female nutria can start breeding before she is even a year old and can produce several litters annually. And it is not only the marsh grass that suffers. Nutria burrow directly into levees and flood banks, honeycombing the earth with tunnels that weaken the very walls Louisiana depends on to keep the Gulf out during hurricane season. A rodent that eats roots for breakfast is, in a very literal sense, chewing holes in the state's flood defenses. Picture it for a second. Before sunrise, a trapper is already knee-deep in cold marsh water, checking a line of traps he set the night before, a burlap sack over one shoulder that gets heavier with every stop. Mist still sitting low over the water, the only sound the slap of the boat paddle, and, somewhere off in the reeds, the splash of something large slipping away before he even gets close enough to see it. He is not doing this for sport. He is doing it because the state is paying him, tail by tail, to slow down the disappearance of his own coastline. The federal government now puts $12 million a year behind this fight, triple what it spent a few years ago, because the swamp rat with the buck teeth has been quietly costing Louisiana its own shoreline for the better part of a century. Is a $6 bounty impressive next to what is coming later on this list? Not even close, but it is the first page in the case file, and every outlaw on this list started with a number just like it. That is outlaw number 5. Outlaw number 4. The state, Texas. And this is the entry where the state stopped bothering with a bounty altogether and just changed the law. Feral hogs are not one species doing damage in Texas. They are an army. More than 2.6 million of them are currently rooting through 253 of Texas's 254 counties, which means there is almost nowhere left in the state without them. A single sow can breed again within 4 months of giving birth, and a litter can run as high as a dozen piglets at a time. Do the math on that across a decade, and you understand why Texas stopped issuing hog licenses the normal way. There is no season. There is no bag limit. You can legally hunt a feral hog in Texas 365 days a year, and the state will not blink. But the real headline is what happened in 2011, when Texas passed what everybody in the state still calls the pork chopper bill. It legalized shooting feral hogs from a helicopter, and almost overnight it created an entire industry. Companies now sell seats on hog hunting helicopters, sometimes for thousands of dollars a trip, and hand shooters a rifle or, if they pay enough, a fully automatic weapon. One company alone claims to have killed close to 10,000 hogs from the air in a year and a half. It barely made a dent. Wildlife officials estimate that Texas has to kill somewhere between 60 and 70% of its entire hog population every single year, just to keep the numbers from climbing higher. Helicopters are not even the only tactic in the state's playbook. Wildlife managers also use what they call a Judas hog, an animal captured, fitted with a GPS collar, and released back into the brush so it wanders straight home to its own sounder, leading trackers to every hog in the group at once. It sounds almost unfair, and it is meant to be, because the stakes go well beyond torn-up crop rows. Feral hogs carry diseases like brucellosis and pseudorabies that can spread to cattle, and a hog, rooting through a hunting lease, can undo a rancher's fencing in a single night. Try to picture the view from inside one of those helicopters at first light, the pilot banking low over a stretch of brush country while a sounder of 20 or 30 hogs breaks and scatters below like a shadow spilling across the ground. It looks less like hunting and more like an air raid, because in every sense that matters, it is one. Texas lawmakers even floated a bill to legalize hunting hogs from hot air balloons, an idea nobody in the balloon industry actually wanted. Balloon operators pointed out that the propane burners needed to keep a basket airborne roar loud enough to spook every hog within earshot long before a hunter could take a shot, and unlike a helicopter, a balloon cannot exactly chase anything that runs. The bill passed anyway, more as a statement of how seriously the state takes the problem than as a practical hunting method. The damage bill sits at roughly $400 million a year in ruined fences, torn-up crops, and dead livestock, and that is the reason a state famous for guarding its own skies decided to open them up to civilians hunting rodents from a chopper. That is outlaw number 4, and it is the first entry on this list where the states stopped asking nicely. Outlaw number 3. The states, since this one crosses a border, Maryland and Virginia. And this is where the case file stops being about money and starts being about the law itself. The northern snakehead looks like something built to survive an apocalypse. It has a flattened head, sharp teeth, a body built like an eel, and a set of lungs strong enough to let it breathe air directly. Take it out of the water, and it does not die the way a normal fish does. It can flip and wriggle across wet grass for real distances, moving from one pond to another entirely over land, which is exactly how it earned the nickname Frankenfish the moment anglers first found it in a small pond in Crofton, Maryland, back in 2002. That single pond became a national story. Biologists who searched it found not just adults but a whole generation of juveniles growing up behind them, proof the fish was already breeding in American water. Officials made the decision to poison the entire pond with chemical treatment rather than risk a single snakehead surviving long enough to reach a connected waterway. And, for a while, it looked like the case might actually end there, contained to one small pond behind a shopping center. It did not work everywhere. The species is now established in the Potomac, the Rappahannock, the York, and the James Rivers, and it has spread into Delaware as well. Here is what makes it different from every other name on this list. It is not just legal to kill a snakehead in Maryland and Virginia. It is against the law to put one back in the water alive once you have taken possession of it. State code is explicit. If you catch one and intend to keep it, you must kill it immediately. If you do not intend to keep it, you may release it, but only on the spot, without ever taking it home or moving it to another body of water. Possessing a live snakehead, or transporting one anywhere, carries fines that can run into the thousands of dollars per fish. Maryland recently gave the species its own official name, the Chesapeake channa, and still tells anglers the same thing. Catch it, keep it if you want it, but the moment it leaves the water in your hands, its case is already closed. Picture an angler pulling one out of the Potomac on a warm afternoon, watching it thrash and gasp on the dock, and realizing the choice in front of them is not really a choice at all. Under state law, there is only one legal ending to that story. Some anglers even receive small incentives for reporting or removing them, a quieter cousin of Louisiana's cash for tails system. Except here, the payment is really just a bonus, on top of a rule that was never optional to begin with. Quick pause before we keep going, because we are exactly at the halfway point of this list, and the next two files only escalate from here. If you are still with us, that tells me you want to see how far a government will actually go, so make sure you are subscribed before Outlaw number 2, because it gets a lot stranger from here. The snakehead earns its spot at number 3, not because of a bounty, and not because of a helicopter, but because an entire legal system decided that letting it live was no longer a choice anglers were allowed to make. That is Outlaw number 3. Outlaw number 2. The state, Florida. And this is the point on the list where the government stopped relying on ordinary citizens altogether and built a paid professional hit squad instead. Burmese pythons are native to Southeast Asia, and nobody fully agrees on how they first got loose in the Everglades, though most researchers point to the exotic pet trade of the 1980s and 90s, animals released or escaped that found a swamp with almost nothing standing in their way. They have no natural predator in South Florida. They can grow past 15 feet long, and a single clutch of eggs can run past 50 at a time. In the areas of the Everglades where pythons are thickest, researchers surveying the roadways found that populations of raccoons, opossums, and bobcats had collapsed by more than 90% compared to areas the snakes had not yet reached. Rabbits and foxes, once common along those same roads, stopped turning up in the surveys almost entirely. Necropsies on captured pythons have turned up full-grown deer in their stomachs, and in at least a few documented cases, alligators, which tells you everything about how far up the food chain this snake has managed to climb, in a swamp where it was never supposed to exist at all. So in 2017, the South Florida Water Management District did something no other state on this list has done. It hired people to hunt pythons as an actual job. Python removal agents are paid an hourly wage, currently somewhere between $13 and $30 an hour depending on the terrain, for up to 10 hours a day out in the Everglades. On top of that hourly rate, every python they remove earns a bonus, $50, for anything up to 4 feet long, and an extra $25 for every foot beyond that. Find and remove a verified nest of eggs, and there is another bonus on top of that. Contractors working this program have removed more than 16,000 pythons since it began. Once a year, the state throws open a public competition called the Florida Python Challenge, drawing close to 1,000 hopeful hunters, professionals, and total beginners alike into the swamp over 10 days, competing for a cash prize that runs into the tens of thousands of dollars for whoever brings in the most snakes. Most competitors go home without catching a single one, which tells you something important. Even with a paycheck, a public competition, and 16,000 snakes already removed, this is still one of the hardest animals in America to actually find. Picture a removal agent moving through the Everglades after dark, headlamp cutting a narrow beam through the sawgrass, moving slowly because a python this size can be nearly invisible until it is close enough to touch. Some of the biggest catches on record have stretched past 17 feet, animals strong enough that it takes 2 or 3 people just to carry one out. This is not a bounty program anymore. It is a payroll, with hourly wages, performance bonuses, and an actual leaderboard, all built around a single goal: keeping one invasive snake from finishing the job it has already mostly done to the mammals of the Everglades. That is why the python outranks the snakehead, the hogs, and the nutria combined. Louisiana pays by the tail. Texas opened its skies. Maryland and Virginia changed the law itself. Florida built an entire government job around hunting one animal, and even with 16,000 pythons removed and counting, the state still has not caught up to how many are left out there. That is outlaw number 2. Outlaw number 1, the state, Washington. And this is the file that ends differently from every other one on this list, because it is the only case that is actually closed. In the fall of 2019, officials in Whatcom County, right up against the Canadian border, confirmed something no one in the country wanted to hear. The Asian giant hornet, later renamed the northern giant hornet, had arrived in the United States. A related detection turned up the same year just across the border in British Columbia, Canada, which told officials on both sides of the line that this was not a single insect blown off course. It was an actual foothold. At 2 inches long, it is the largest hornet on Earth, with a stinger long enough to pierce a standard beekeeping suit and venom strong enough to require hospitalization in a bad sting. Within weeks of the first confirmed find, headlines were calling it the murder hornet, a nickname the insect never shook. But the real horror story here was never really about people. It was about honeybees. A small group of these hornets can wipe out an entire hive in less than 90 minutes, decapitating the bees one by one and carrying the bodies back to feed their own young. For a state that depends on honeybees to pollinate its orchards and berry fields, that made the hornet an economic threat as much as a physical one. So Washington and the federal government did something that had never really been attempted before. They launched a multi-year, multi-agency manhunt for an insect. Entomologists set out roughly 1,000 traps across the northwest corner of the state, and when the public reported sightings, teams would respond, capture a live hornet if they could, and glue a tiny radio tracking tag onto its body before releasing it back into the wild. Then they would follow the beeping signal on foot, sometimes for hours, all the way back to the nest. In 2021, one of those tracked nests turned up inside a dead alder tree, a quarter-mile from the Canadian border, and when the team vacuumed it out, they pulled nearly 1,500 hornets in various stages of development from inside a comb built in 9 separate layers, with dozens more caught in nets around the site before the operation was finished. Every nest destroyed that way was one less colony that could send out new queens the following spring, and every single spring for the next several years, entomologists went right back out to check the same stretch of forest, because the only way to be sure a case like this is closed is to keep checking long after the evidence stops turning up. Picture the moment a tracking team, dressed head to toe in thick white protective suits, kneels beside the base of that tree in the dark, listening to a single radio beep grow louder with every step, knowing that on the other end of that signal is a nest that could still produce next year's queens. That is not pest control. That is a stakeout. For 3 years after that operation, state and federal officials kept up trapping and public outreach across the region, and nothing more turned up. And then, In December of 2024, the Washington State Department of Agriculture and the United States Department of Agriculture made an announcement no other state on this list has ever been able to make. The northern giant hornet was declared eradicated, not just from Washington, but from the entire country. Officials called it one of the only times in modern history that a full-blown government eradication campaign against an invasive insect has actually succeeded. They are still keeping traps out as insurance, because as one of the lead officials put it at the time, the hornet got into the country once already, and it could happen again. That is why this outlaw tops the list. Not because it is the most dangerous animal here, it probably is not even close. It tops the list because it is the only case file on this entire countdown that the government actually got to close. Every other outlaw on this list is still out there tonight, in a Louisiana marsh, a Texas brush field, a Maryland river, a Florida swamp, still one step ahead of the people hired to bring them in. Outlaw number 1 very nearly got away too. For 3 years, nobody could prove it hadn't. And then, for the first time in this entire investigation, the trail simply went cold, and stayed cold, until the case was finally, officially, closed. So here is what this list is actually about. It was never really about which of these 5 animals could hurt you the worst, because on that measure, none of them come close to some of the ordinary wildlife already living in your own backyard. This list was about something else. How far a government will go once it decides an animal has to be stopped, and how rarely, even with every tool available, that effort actually finishes the job. A cash bounty is the easiest tool in the box, and Louisiana is still writing $6 checks for Nutria tails more than 20 years after it started. A change in hunting law is the next step up, and Texas hunters are still climbing into helicopters over brush country that never runs out of hogs. A change to the law itself, backed by real fines, is further still, and anglers on the Potomac are still required by statute to end a snakehead's life the moment it leaves the water. A full-time paid workforce is further still, and python removal agents are walking the Everglades tonight with headlamps and hourly wages, 16,000 snakes in, and nowhere near finished. And at the very top sits the only operation on this entire list that actually worked. 3 years of radio tags, vacuum crews, and international cooperation, ending in the one file on this desk, stamped closed. 4 outlaws are still out there right now, doing exactly what they were doing before any of these programs existed. One is not, and it took almost everything a modern government had to make that true. That is the real lesson buried under all the bounties and helicopters and hourly wages. Nature does not read the paperwork, and once something is loose in a marsh, or a swamp, or a stretch of open brush, the only reliable way anyone has ever found to put it back is not a fine, or a bounty, or even a helicopter. It is simply not letting it out in the first place. Tonight, somewhere in a Louisiana marsh, a trapper checks one more line before the light goes. Somewhere over Texas brush country, a helicopter banks low over ground that never stops producing hogs. Somewhere on the Potomac, a fish surfaces that state law has already sentenced the moment it clears the water. Somewhere in the Everglades, a headlamp beam sweeps low across the sawgrass, hunting for something 15 feet long and nearly invisible. And somewhere in Washington, a single empty trap sits at the edge of a forest, checked out of habit more than necessity, watching for a case that the government already, officially, closed.